We are recording.
All right.
Yeah, sorry I'm late. I was reading book Zeta,
Yeah.
and that is a very deep dive into like mereology and stuff. It's fascinating. It's all about forms, I guess, and the validity of the theory and substance.
Yeah. No. That's awesome that you're going there. That is. That's. Yeah. That's really the meat of this book is Zeta, and then Theta is when he's really going to go into the potency and actuality discussion and lead from the discussion of causes through substance to substance is really the focus of Zeta, and then we get to potency and actuality and Theta as clarifying the problems that arose in thinking substance in Zeta. So this is, there's a loose narrative thread through this book, but it's very loose because there's so many other things that are just brought up for one's attention and that are worth thinking about, but they don't necessarily contribute very much to a continuous narrative. So one of the tricks of this book is not to go down every rabbit hole.
Ooh.
All right. Well, it's 10 minutes after. I kind of had this introductory thing that I was going to do. I was hoping maybe a couple more of the folks from Rashid's Aristotle group would be here for this, because it addresses some of the stuff that we were talking about in the proofs of God. Yeah. Maybe I'll hold off a little bit and do that towards the end, just in case we get a couple more people. All right. So why don't we just start reading then, and I will do my introduction either towards the end of this. So we're struggling through some of the chapters in Beta, and the reason why we're struggling through these is because Aristotle announced at the beginning that the science we are searching for, right, and that we do not know whether it exists or not, is precisely that body of knowledge that would be the solution to these problems that he not so much discusses as pours forth in this book Beta. So as painful and as abbreviated a number of these remarks are, we're going to do our best to make some sense of some of them. What I'm most interested in is dwelling on parts of piece 7, where he denies that being is a genus. Being is a genus and the one is a genus. I've kind of worked it out in my head and with a little diagram with being, not so much with the one. So, but he treats them parallel. So maybe light shed on one will be light shed on the other. Okay, so B1 and B2, well, actually B2, he was discussing all the different impasses that the mind is blocked by in trying to think about whether the science we're searching for, the science of being, the knowledge of being, is one unified knowledge, or is the knowledge of many things, and thereby becomes many different knowledges. Kind of like our, sciences, the science of astronomy and the science of sociology and the science of economics. They're not one science, even though they all have a similar method. But their object domains are not united in one great world, right? None of them is a science of being. So knowledge breaks down into all these little parcelized, fragmented, partial worlds that we're familiar with in our scientific inquiry. And he makes the point over and over and over again that if there is this science, then it is one science. And but that leads to all sorts of puzzles. And it's more puzzling if it's many sciences, because then that basically would mean that the science we're looking for in this book doesn't exist at all. So we were looking at the knowledge side and looking to see how, looking to see what kind of puzzles need to be solved in thinking about the kind of knowledge that metaphysics is. Right? And now we're going into the kind of thing that metaphysical knowledge would be knowledge of, were it to exist. All right, so that's where we're beginning with B3. So let's read through. Let's read through in what in our text is called Puzzle 6, and work out basically what it is that what the problem is. Right? There's no solutions here. We need to get clear on the problem. Do I have a reader? Or yeah. We'll read, and then if anybody has any preliminary questions before we get bite into the text, please pose them either right now or right after the reading. But I already see Charlie's hand, so I'm going to go to you.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You gonna do it, Brendan, or no?
Oh, sorry. Is someone else?
No, but somebody's a microphone was on. Now it's off.
Or the
Oh,
guy
okay.
who's mine.
Now it's on. There we go.
This might be too early in this session to ask. It might become clear, but we're dealing here with causes, starting points, demonstrations, and first principles.
Yeah.
And I'm not really clear on how they all fit together.
Right.
So that's probably going to be the topic of discussion today, or part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we don't need to clarify all that now, but that would be one of the goals I would like to have today, is to get those a little bit clearer of how they're related to each other.
Awesome. Then bring that up, please, as we get more information in this text. And I don't think that there is going to be a neat and tidy explanation that would, compartmentalize these terms. I think that sometimes they're used synonymously and sometimes they're not used synonymously, depending on the passage we're reading. And part of that is because sometimes Aristotle is reciting the assertions of some other philosopher, right, that uses maybe might use first principles, where he might use starting points or something like that. And so the terminology does lose focus, which I think we can basically live with more or less, but there are going to be passages where that might actually be something that we stumble over, and we should get clear on the context and how he's using those words. So when the terminological stuff gets in the way, let's dig in there. All right, who's going to read? All right, well then I will, but hopefully somebody else will read the next one. Where these issues are concerned, then there is much puzzlement both about the way we should put things in order to hit on the truth, and about the starting points, namely whether it is the genera that we should take to be elements and starting points, or rather the primary components present in each thing. For example, the elements and starting points of voiced sound seem to be those primary things from which voiced sounds are composed, not the common genus, voiced sound. And we speak of the elements of diagrams as those things whose demonstrations are present in the demonstrations of the other things, either all of them or of most. Such an Aristotelian, completely strange sentence. Further, both those who say that there are several elements of bodies and those who say that there is one speak of the things from which a body is composed as starting points. For example, Empedocles says that fire, water, and the ones that come after these are elements present in beings from which these beings are composed, but does not speak of these as genera of beings. In addition to this, if we also want to examine the nature of other things, for example, a bed, when we know the parts from which it is composed and the way they are put together, then we know its nature. On the basis of these arguments, then, the genera would not be the starting point of beings. On the other hand, as we know each thing through the definitions, and the genera are the starting point of definitions, then the genera must also be the starting points of the definable things. And if to get scientific knowledge of beings is to get it of the species, in accord with which beings are said to be what they are, the genera are starting points, at any rate, of the species. And some even of those who speak of the one, or being, or the great and small as elements of beings apparently treat them as genera. But then neither is it possible to speak of the starting points in both ways, for the account of the substance is one, whereas the definition by means of genera will be distinct from the definition that states the components present in a thing. All right. So this one's a bit more straightforward, I think, but let's kind of recollect it together.
Well, I'm
So,
just going to talk.
Oh, pardon me?
Oh, I was just going to talk since nobody was raising their hand.
Oh, awesome. Please do. Yeah, dive in.
I think one of the things he's kind of highlighting here is what you might call a top-down versus bottom-up approach.
Nice.
And I think he's highlighting that you certainly, you're going to, in some sense, need both, but to think you can get from the bottom to the top, it seems like he's ruling it out, but in a very ambiguous way.
Well, yeah, but the first paragraph seems to be the case for a bottom-up view.
Right.
And so maybe we can start by gathering, the arguments for a bottom-up view that are at least presented in this particular aporia. Brendan, you want to dive in?
Yeah. So this, it's so strange how there's this common narrative. So I was reading the prologue to Phenomenology of Spirit, and he's talking. My favorite part is where he's contrasting mathematical knowledge with the philosophical knowledge that we want. And he talks about this, he says, when we're doing a mathematical proof, it's easy to say that the theorem stands alone by itself, but we must incorporate the proof itself. And also notice that when we do a proof on, for example, a triangle, we actually kind of only look at specific elements of the triangle, but at the end is, so I feel like, and for Hegel, he's advocating a holistic sort of, I still don't exactly know what the solution is, but so what is Aristotle trying to say here? He's trying to say that, well, obviously things are made of many parts, but the thing that we are trying to talk about is made up of those parts, and it's somehow defined by those parts, but it's not the primary thing. Or I don't know what the conclusion is. That's kind of what I'm getting at. What is the conclusion of the puzzle? Or
I don't think he's
yet?
giving us one right here. I think what he's kind of introducing this as a problem.
Yeah, well, it's a puzzle, but it did seem like there was some sort of reflection that he had on.
Sophia, this is the bathroom, Pumpkin. You got to go before you get on the airplane. Sorry, guys.
It's okay. Sorry. Brendan, were you in the course of responding to Tyler?
Yeah. Well, here he does actually talk about he does seem to make some conclusions. I don't really know, but let me just skim over this.
Well, I mean, let's.
Yeah,
Oh, go ahead.
that's fine.
Sorry.
No, I don't have any response.
All right, so let's just at least try to figure out, what's the point of this first example with a voiced sound, right? He writes, the elements and starting points of voiced sound seem to be those primary things from which voiced sounds are composed, not the common genus voiced sound, right? So how do you understand that? And it seems like it might be obvious, but maybe it's not obvious. So let's play with it a sec for a little bit.
Well, he's saying that when you voice a sound, you could, says the elements are the starting points. So by elements, I'm guessing he's saying, frequencies, pitches, and stuff like that. And they definitely seem to be the primary things. He doesn't say why he thinks that they're first in line for whatever reason, but it's interesting to note maybe that the elements by themselves don't have any content, and so the simpler something is, maybe the more primary it is. Yeah, I don't really know what he wants to say about what things are primary.
No. That's what we're trying to figure out. So let's just try to take this example and see what we can draw out of it. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, just tackling on to what Brendan just said. I think, so he's still asking questions. I don't know if he's decided, but I think he's differentiating between, in a way, the material cause. So in a particular instance of voice sound, you have, like the frequency, you have the vibration of the air, if I'm talking, the rattling of my vocal cords or whatever. But then also the genus, the universal of voice sound, which is substance. And he's differentiating between those two.
Right. So, I mean, I don't think he was thinking about frequencies and anything like that. I think he's probably thinking about like vowel sounds and consonant sounds, and right, and that those separate sounds come together in a word, and it seems to be that it seems like words and sentences would be built up out of these elementary units, right? These voiced sounds. And it doesn't seem like, at least prima facie, that the genus voiced sound is playing any role in understanding a word, right? The way what comes together in a word, right, to make it one word. It doesn't seem like voice sound has any explanatory role there at all. So at least prima facie, we have the idea that, well, this word is made up of letters, and letters all have different sounds, and those sounds, it's precisely the difference of those different sounds that makes the word possible. That's what I'm sort of thinking. So Charlie, you want to jump in there? And Mike, if you want to follow.
Yeah, I thought he was talking the same example. Another example comes down below here of what the earth is made of, I think, or no, an example of Empedocles. Empedocles says, well, everything is made of earth, and all these various elements and things like that. And it doesn't seem that there's any larger genera or there's any larger concept that you would use. But then what I thought really interesting was that I can't put my finger on it right now, he suddenly says, no, this is wrong. The idea of substance is one.
Mm,
He kind of answers the whole thing. You know, it seems to me, what line did that occur?
no, that was yeah, the very end of P6.
Yeah, yes, the very end of what you read.
Mm-hmm.
There it is in line 11, 12.
Mm-hmm.
But then neither is it possible to speak of the starting points, plural, in both ways. For the account of substance is one.
Right.
Now, that is he giving away his whole project here of aporia, that he's going through all this, you know, of saying, look, you cannot understand, and he's going to continue here to say you can't understand things from the particular. That he just came out and said it, didn't he? Or not? I don't know.
Tyler, you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I think his point is that if we treat substances as many, then they belong to some higher category, namely substance. So a substance cannot be the substance as such.
What was
There
that?
would be
A
members.
substance cannot be what?
A substance,
Uh-huh.
right? A particular substance cannot be substance as such because it presupposes a higher category of what it is a member of, right? It's a species rather than the genera.
So are we then
So,
to
like
treat,
the third man.
sorry to cut in, are we then to treat primary substance also as not being substance as such when he talks about primary substance?
We'll find out. I also think one of the things going on here is that we have, oh, can you scroll up? Yeah, so with things being composed up from different elements, we have the issue of if we were to need every species to get to the genera, we would never know if we have enough of them unless we understand why we've decided these count as a species of this genera.
Sorry, just a grammatical remark, right? Genus is singular and genera is plural. So if you're referring to just one genus, you'll use the word genus.
Oh yeah, I should be using genus.
Yeah, so we don't know very much about substance, and I promise you, he is going to get more specific about substance, right? But I think Charlie's right that he does just come out with an Aristotelian thesis here. The account, right, the logos of the substance is one, and so we don't know what that means yet. But it is what causes the aporia. Right. It seems like we should be able to describe things bottom up or top down, depending on the purpose of your investigation or where at what level you happen to be at, right? And Aristotle is rejecting that notion that there is this slightly arbitrary decision that one makes about how to speak about substance, right? So the account of the substance is one, whereas what he's been presenting is two separate ways. So one of them has to be correct, but we don't know which. Right, and the thing about the Empedocles that's kind of interesting is on the one hand we've been treating the four elements as if they were genera, and he says that Empedocles is not treating when he says fire, he actually means the instance of fire in all of its different forms and not a genus of things, right? And so And so what he's suggesting is that the four elements of Empedocles are themselves they're they're both universal and singular, right? Fire is at the basis of everything warm, but it's not because all of these warm things share a common property, right? Some abstraction like they're all warm, right? But the being of fire is in all of them, right? So the being of fire, to use a Neoplatonic metaphor, unfolds itself into all of the warm things. And so heat is not simply is not an abstraction as common to all of these things, but it's actually the presence of fire in everything. And so the way in which these elements are functioning in this discourse is, well, we will say they don't have any logical being. Their way of being is not a logical one, the way animal is. Instead, it is a presence of the actual universal element fire in everything that is hot, right? And for Aristotle, that makes it a component or a part of things rather than a genus. So I just thought I'd point that out. I don't know if anybody noticed that, how strange that was, but it seems to me like that is going to play a role in how he understands what's matter.
Yeah, I think the part whole and the composition topics are going to be important, and I think that the issues of if everything is built up from one thing, where do the differences come from? I think we've already gone over that, but right. I'm assuming it's going to resurface and be treated again here.
So anyway, I mean, so he's just kind of given us a laundry list of things that seem that give the impression that if we know the components, we know the thing, right? And he gives the example of the bed. When we know the parts from which it is composed and the way they are put together, then we know its nature. Okay, on this basis, then the genera would not be the starting points of beings. Okay, so now we've run through some of that, and the opposing arguments he gives in the next paragraph, right? Insofar as we know each thing through definitions, and the genera the starting points of definitions, then the genera must also be the starting points of definable things. And if to get scientific knowledge of beings is to get it of the species in accord with which beings are said, the genera are starting points at any rate of the species. All right, what's he talking about there? Right. Okay. So let's just take an example, right? I mean, the classical example is always the definition of the human being, right? Human being as a rational animal, or yeah.
You've got hands up, by the way.
Oh, I appreciate it. I didn't see that. Brendan.
Yes. I think that this whole and part thing definitely. I wasn't thinking about the emergence thing that Tyler was talking about, where if everything's composed of the same thing, where the differences. I was more thinking about why it is that he doesn't distinguish between the definition of something and the thing itself. Is he aware that like we can't talk about things like that? He's like, so yeah, the first part, line 4, on the other hand, insofar as we know each other through the definitions and the genera, the starting points of the definitions, then the genera must be the starting points of the definable thing. So he's almost like positing, he's saying like, it's almost like the, phenomena and noumena distinction here. And I don't know if he can make that conclusion from the point of view of us now.
Right. You know, I think the best way to think about this issue is that science had progressed far enough in Aristotle's time that the order of the universe was understandable from a mathematical point of view, right? We have the Pythagorean worldview that yielded the mathematical relations that we find exhibit in all perceptible things, suggests that there is an overarching order to the universe that is not reducible to the perceptible things, right? And so, so it's not enough. So he doesn't need to make the distinction between how we talk about a perceptual object and what it really is, because its reality has already been recognized as being fundamentally mathematical in nature. And our only access to this mathematical nature is through thought and how we think about those mathematical things. And at this point, we're beyond the problem of naming things, right? We have an understanding of lines and points and triangles and how rectangles are built out of triangles, and then you can get solids out of these things, and all of these things are purely what we would today would say conceptual. And so we have the concept, right? We understand all these geometrical relationships, and then the names come afterwards, right? We understand the difference between a point or a point non-extended and extending the point into a line, right? We can do that whether we have a name for those two dimensions or not. So the point is that we have the relations in thought, and the names come later. The names are not how we get to them. The names are just kind of labels for these conceptual relations. And so that's why, but we only get to those conceptual relations by contemplating the relations of sun and light rays and shade and all of these perceptual things that we go beyond to their mathematical relations that the Pythagoreans were the first to, at least if in Greek memory, to have developed. So there is no reality of a thing that is separate from how it's thought. There's the appearance of things that are separate from how they're thought. All right. So it's because of that, I think, that he's not so much worried about distinguishing between, you know, what the word bucket of water refers to and the name itself and the difference between the name and thing. I think Greek science has progressed beyond this at this point. Mike, you want to follow up on that, or pursue a different line?
I'm actually not following up on that. I was going to go back to your original question about
Cool.
the two sentences, but I can wait if someone wants to.
Oh, no. I think I answered to the best of my ability right now, Brendan's question. You know, Brendan's question, I think, is rooted in this, in the primacy of the perceptual, and that might have made sense with some chapters of the physics, but here in the metaphysics, right, we're thinking strictly perceptual things, and trying to get a bead on them, and just relying on the names won't help us anymore in this reflective, conceptual, noetic domain that we're right now, like explorers, starting to chart. You know, what belongs where in this noetic world, this world of thought. So I hope that helps, Brendan. You can follow up with it later, but I'd like to hear what direction Mike wants to go.
Yeah, just going back to your question from a few minutes ago about what the first two sentences are about. I think the first two sentences are wait, no, sorry, the first two sentences of that paragraph. So starting on 4. I think they're both saying the same thing. The first one, it's kind of what they're both saying the same thing, and they're both saying that the genera
Uh-huh.
are the starting points of things. I don't think he's saying that conclusively, he's just positing that. So the first sentence is, if we know things through definitions, and the genera are the starting points of definitions, therefore the genera are starting points of things. And then the next sentence, if in order to get scientific knowledge of beings, we get it through the species. So Mike is, I don't know, of the species of American male. I don't know, whatever. And then in order to get, and then the genera are starting points of the species, then we get the same conclusion that the genera are the starting point of things. So I was just going back to your question.
I can't raise my hand because I'm sharing the screen, so I'm going to just butt in every now and then.
Please.
I think, so this is, I guess, getting a little bit back maybe even to Brendan's question about, well, it seems like there's a difference between the starting points and the elements. And it's like one is like sort of like what one something is made up of, and the other one is how things are understood. How do we understand things? Like maybe one's dealing with the perceptible side of things, and others dealing with the intelligible side of things.
Right.
The genre and this understanding, because you cannot, I mean, he's later on, he's going to make the point that you can't there is no scientific knowledge of the individual.
Right.
You can only have scientific knowledge of something that is a class that has many elements, because otherwise there's nothing to know about them other than this complete particular list of all the particularities, which isn't really knowledge.
Awesome. Yeah, totally. Tyler.
Yeah, I was going to mention that definitions are going to play more of a role, something like a criteria here, or criterion. But I think an interesting thing to point out is that the starting points all take it that we have to start from one thing in order to stand another kind of thing through their relation. But there is a problem if you're starting from the smallest to the greatest thing that I think is asymmetrical, because if you're starting from the smallest thing, I think you have no space to access the greatest thing unless the smallest thing is already a part of the greatest thing.
Well, that would take some argument, but that logical space that you're denying. I mean, you know me, I kind of inclined to agree with you, but the question is what's our reason for thinking that? I don't know if you want to go there right now. If you got something pithy, please do. But if you have something long-winded, we'll pick it up at another time.
It would probably end up long-winded, but I guess the pithy thing is that both of these ways of trying to understand things are ways of giving accounts.
Right.
And so they're already a part of something higher.
I see. Okay. Interesting. Interesting. I'm not quite sure how to relate. I think that there's some truth to that, but I'm not quite sure what the Aristotelian text would be to fortify that point. So we'll just kind of register it right now and get back to this whole genus thing. What the point I wanted to make a little bit earlier was, if we just think of the classic example of the human being a rational animal, right? If that's what a human being is, and we try to attain that through finding parts of the human being and trying to figure out how they go together to make a human being. Right. We can ask, first of all, what parts? How are we going to divide the human being up such that we get those parts that added back together will get us the human being, right? Do we take limbs and organs? Do we take sinew and bone? Do we take is it individual cells? If we break the human being down to,
Are you speaking to me?
oh, no, I'm just asking, I'm just making a point about the problem of trying to compose the human being out of some kind of part, the way we can compose a bed out of its parts. And I'm getting additionally at the point that why is it, or this is the point. How is it that knowing the parts of the bed allows us to, and the way they're put together allows us to know what the bed is?
Yeah, it seems to be tucked in, swept under the rug here in the way of putting it together.
Right, right. And so I kind of want to just put my finger here on, the Aristotelian terminology. We know the act of the bed. We know it's act. Now, act is of course strange for us, but the term we have been using is functional unity. We know what it's for, what its purpose is, and that allows us to determine which are its relevant parts, right? Legs, I don't know, whatever the mattress, whatever the mattress is held up by, right? The headboard, right? We can determine what the relevant parts of the bed are, because we know what the point of the whole is. We know, for instance, that the leg is one part and not 3 parts, right? And it doesn't make any sense to break the legs down into 5 or 10 or 150 parts, because because the point is that those pieces of leg are not actually parts of the bed.
Yeah, pithy remark is way they are put together also is true for account giving. It's a way of putting things together.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. So, so I think what we're getting at here with this, the genera and the definitions, right? We know. It seems like all we need are the parts of the bed and how to put them together, and we know its nature. But I want to suggest that that's an incomplete picture. We have to know what those parts are parts for in order to know the nature of the thing that we're putting together with the components. Mm-hmm. So one might say we need to know the form of the bed.
Right. Otherwise, like, how would you know where to put each part, right?
Exactly. Now, now let's say you come from a culture that's never seen a bed, and somebody gives you a bunch of parts and says, put them together in this way. Do you know what you have when you're done? No, you don't know what it's for. Right. So there's this prior knowledge that, let me put it, the bottom up, and I think this is Tyler's point, bottom up approaches always presuppose this knowledge of what we're building up to, but they don't acknowledge that purpose that we're building towards is actually part of the nature of the thing. They want to take that part out. And so that gives us at least a foothold for understanding why we might want to go the other way around and start with the genera and start from the top up. And because the definition is going to be that which gives us the nature of the thing, and thereby we know which are its relevant parts, right? We know what a finger is, not by chopping up into 1,000 pieces, but by looking at how it's jointed, right? And we can get at its relevant parts that way, because in the joints we discover its functional unity or its act.
Can I make another quick point?
Yeah, go ahead, and then Brendan.
Yeah, in order to know
thank you,
how the parts should be put together, you can't just be given instructions, because just being told something doesn't mean you know it, right?
Excellent. All right, so I've got, I'm assuming that this list is in the correct chronological order. If it's not, please correct me. I've got Brendan, Clark, and then Nick. Is that how you experienced it?
Well, I put my hand up way long.
Oh,
I
okay,
can
then
wave
Peter,
my
yeah,
hand.
Peter, sorry.
Nobody sees me, my hand
Yeah,
waving.
no,
but
I
anyway,
understand that, Peter, but that's why I just want you to interject, because I'd often.
I am. That's what I'm, anyway,
Excellent.
sorry. I was just going to say that also in the phenomenology, when we're reading Ben Observing Reason, where does classification count as understanding something?
Mm-hmm.
And by just knowing that the bed has 4 parts, has 4 legs and a flat thing, we don't yet know what the bed is for, even though we can describe it.
Right.
And so a mere external classificatory, latching onto external things and being able to classify things, classifying bugs, whether they have 6 legs or 8 legs or 100 legs or whatever, that doesn't really help us. I mean, it allows us to distinguish them, but that's from the perceptual side. You're only going to get the ergon or the work or the note, what the thing is for, through the conceptual or the being side.
Exactly.
So the bed, so that's why that's not a complete account on the bed, because just knowing there's these parts and they're arranged this way is just description and not getting at the essence of the thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, exactly. And I'd like to just follow up with, we can kind of play that out on the voiced sound, right? Because there needs to be, right? There needs to be some understanding of the units of sound, right? That yield a determinate meaning. And that is, again, understanding language as a whole in order to understand what the various parts of the language, what makes them specific, meaningful unit sounds, right? So I just wanted to follow. I think that we can look at these examples as all in the first part of this as all exhibiting the same kind of defect. All right, Brendan first, then Clark, then Nick.
Yeah, so I just wanted to notice out loud that it seems like we're grasping with the bottom, from the top down perspective, we're really talking about there being something before the thing that is necessary for it. And I think if we wanted to, we could explain it as teleological intuition. Would they say evolutionary biologists, or at least one of them I heard say that humans, everything that a human does in life is a tool for something else. And usually, either a tool for survival, reproduction, or a tool for another tool. And I think that the whole conundrum with trying to do metaphysics about that thing that is prior to what we actually get to work with in this situation, the problem with that is that we don't get to work with the content of these concepts that we do kind of work with the content of them. We don't get to do math on them per se. We don't get to work with them like tools.
Right.
So I guess I kind of mixed 2 things at once, but those are kind of my thoughts about what I was accumulating.
No, I appreciate it. I think you're making the point that a tool is always for something, and that for something is not always another tool. So we ultimately we're going to avoid the infinite regress by something that by recognizing that the tools are always aligned with purposes. And what are those purposes? How do we understand those purposes? So no, I appreciate it. Thanks, Clark.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, great. When Aristotle looked up at the sky, well, let me say first, does he treat the sublunary experiences of things, and then the genera, the larger classifications of things, the particulars and then the thing, and the genera, species genera. Does he treat that differently than when he looked up at the skies and he saw the heavenly body, the crystalline orbs, the smooth spheres? He looked up at the sky and he used the same method. And this gets to the issue of, do we start with genera and definition, or what are our starting points, right?
Right.
So what are my starting points when I look up at the sky and I see the heavenly light, and I have the mentality of a person, 2,500 years ago?
Right.
I'm going to use this methodology, and I'm going to come to some reconciliation with what my knowledge can be about it. And it seems to me all he sees is light up in the sky. But in fact, he said definitionally, didn't he come to a conclusion that definitionally those were perfect circles? Those were crystalline orbs. And how does that relate to his process that he's describing right now? Because it seems to me he leaped right to the definitions, because how could he do more than just see the light up in the sky? But he gave them words, he gave them properties and predicates.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, he developed a whole story about those lights in the skies.
Right.
That,
Can I interject?
I'm wondering how the knowledge works there.
Right. Tyler, go ahead and pick that up.
I just wanted to highlight that predicating things of things is not defining them yet.
Right. Right. Yeah. Did you? Is that all you wanted to say? Right. So, Nick. Sorry, not Nick. Clark.
Clark.
Yep. There's much more to be said to your question, but Tyler got an essential aspect here, right? To say things about things is not yet to define them, and so, and what I hear you saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that he looked in the sky, and he, so to speak, hastily defined things as having all sorts of properties that seem to be reflected in the motion of the stars, right? And that led him down a garden path of terribly erroneous empirical theory of the heavens.
Well, that's only by virtue of our present knowledge and how we go about what we do,
right.
How we use science today. But
right.
what I'm wondering is, I see a consistency with him giving names and stories to the heavenly bodies that is similar to what he's doing in the terrestrial world of things and ideas, and he's making connections there.
Right.
It's really half-baked question, but it's definitely something
totally
there for
cool.
me.
It's legit. I like your questions, and they're challenging. I don't necessarily always have a really informed Aristotelian answer for them, right? I just think what he's seeing are bodies in motion, and therefore he's seeing nature, and nature is moving, and it moves in mathematical forms, and he treats of that the basic principles for dealing with anything that moves in the physics, and there he'll work out, what are we committed to once we admit that something moves. Right? Does it move through itself? Does it move through another, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And so he doesn't glide past that very ambitious project, is to say, okay, we notice things move. What are we committed to? What concepts have we already deployed? What huge framework is already at work, right? In the very statement that things move. And the answer to that is the physics. Right? So the physics gives you all the principles that you're committed to once you've said things move. And now his word for things that move is nature. And so the physics is everything you're committed to in thinking that there is nature. And then once all those principles are worked out in the physics, then he can go to different domains of nature, like the parts of animals and the stars and geometry. And well, geometry obviously doesn't move, never mind. So his empirical sciences, and show how those principles make knowledge in these specific domains possible. Now, since all empirical science is always going to be based on the quantity and quality of the kinds of observations that you have the technology to obtain, right? All empirical knowledge is fallible, and he knows that as well as anybody else, right? And so it's not a damning thing. It's no more damning for Aristotle's empirical theories to be improved upon based on the improvement of observational methods than it is damning for Galileo or Kepler or Copernicus to have had the exact same thing happen to them.
Sure. Equally unreliable.
Right, so it's all empirical, right? But the principles of motion are not something that you ever perceive. But what he's doing is he's making you aware of what it is that you've already committed to in thinking of anything as moving at all. And that is not an empirical project. And it's something that we often overlook as being relevant. How can we think of things moving without introducing all sorts of contradictions into our discourse, right? Things becoming other than they are, but still remaining the same as they are. Bam, contradiction. This is automatically a false theory. So we have to develop the principles such that we can think motion without falling right and left into one contradiction after another. So that would be my defense and how I'd want to separate the empirical from the analysis of principles that goes on in Aristotle. And the metaphysics.
Yeah, well, that gets to my question: is the connection between the empirical data and what else can be said about it? Mm-hmm. And I know it's the middle cause. I mean, from last time, there's and that cannot be spoken of, and I understand that.
So
I'm not understanding it totally.
They're both kinds of account giving, but we've got Nick for a while having his hand raised.
Thank you very much, Tyler. Nick, go ahead.
Yes, Michael, thanks. I'm really still stuck where Charles question, where Charles brought us to, because I thought I understood this and seemed clear, but since he's parsed it a bit more, I'm a little bit confused. That statement, the second statement, for the account of a substance is one, I'm taking it to mean that there's only one explanation. There's one substance, there's only one. And whereas the definition by means of genre will be distinct from the definition that states the component present in a thing.
Right.
It's just that, I mean, we talk about something and we talk about something in terms of its genre in a definitional way. And we can talk about the same thing in terms of its parts without seeing a contradiction in them. Mm-hmm. So to me, it's almost like these two ways are somewhat orthogonal. And they give you different perspectives. Mm-hmm. This particular paragraph seems to say that there's a contradiction in doing it both ways.
Right.
It only needs to be one way, and it's not very convincing. So I would like, if you could, Michael, to kind of expound on this a bit more. Maybe there's something I'm missing here. Of course, Aristotle is always right, so he's got it.
like Wittgenstein, yeah, that nobody understands but knows he's always right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I'm not prepared. I don't have a pithy way to attack this particular problem. It stuck out to me. I decided to just to leave it. If there's anybody else who's studied some Aristotle who wants to take a crack at it, you're more than welcome to. But I just accepted this as as foreshadowing for what's going to come. And you're totally right that that makes the aporia a little less convincing as an aporia, right? We really have to understand why the account of the substance is one, to understand why there's this tension here at all between starting with components as over against starting with definitions. Garth.
Yeah, I think maybe the way Aristotle uses words like account and definition is somewhat different than the way we use those words. I think we have a lot of assumptions about, being the subject, looking at the object and describing the object when we think about a definition. And I don't think Aristotle has those presuppositions. So the way he's using the words is, in his thinking, different than the way we might think of those words.
Right.
And also, Aristotle often does use the word one, and it's not clear to me, still after reading so much Aristotle, exactly what is signified when he says something is one.
Mm-hmm. No, you're totally right. You're totally right. And as a matter of fact, he doesn't treat that until Book Delta, where he gives us like 26 different ways of understanding the way in which a thing is one. Right. So he gives us like 26 different ways of understanding the way in which something might be one. And then here he just says, well, substance is one. And he doesn't tell us which of those 26 ways is the one he's referring to. Right. So these are the joys of Aristotle. And so when we understand better later on what it means to say that substance is one, we'll understand then why this is an aporia. But I don't have a short lecture for that right now. Let me see. Mike, I saw your.
No, I'm trying to butt in here.
Thanks.
And so I was just in response to the next. So in this sentence that's highlighted, I took it that what he's talking, the definition by means of genre is distinct from the definition from the component. So if you're trying to define something from the component, you get one definition. If you try and define things by going through the genre species things, you get another thing. Mm-hmm. So that's two different things, but the account of substance has to be one. So it can't be going this other way. This forking path is the wrong way in a sense. If the account of substance one, that's why it can't be. That's why we can't think of the first sentence, but then there's a possible speak of the starting point in both ways, because then you get multiple accounts rather than one account. And if it's going to be a science, I think it has to be an account of one account.
I mean, one thing, which is really only terminological and nominal, but substance is always going to be the unity of a many, right? So the substance of this horse is the unity of horse life, and this color being here, and this smell being here, and this hay lying around, and grass being tasty, and all the rest of it, right? So so if we think about the word substance, and we remember its Greek origin as ousia, right? As the beinghood, the being of this being, wherein is its being. And I like to catch that as in how do we understand all of these multiple properties and this temporally extended, spatially extended life as one. That the account of that cannot break this horse into any multiplicity whatsoever. So we are bound by the nature of substance as the unity of the thing. That when we talk about substance, when we talk about its substance, right, we are bound to give an account that demonstrates or shows the unity and doesn't allow this thing to break into a multiplicity. So I think that's so that's just a constraint on how we are allowed to talk about substance. Garth.
Are you saying that being and substance are two various ways they translate the single Greek word ousia?
Yes and no. There's ani, which is just to be. It's just the verb being. If you take being as a participial ongoing process, right? And then the being of that is ousia, or substance. So it's a little bit. I don't want you to think that they're complete synonyms. Right? They're yeah, go
Okay.
ahead.
Second question. Or not. This isn't really a question. I guess I just wanted to point out something that Aristotle sometimes talks about the matter,
Yeah.
and I think when it became clear to me that when he says matter, it's different than when he says substance. Like,
Right.
you know, the matter of the human being is like bone and sinew and muscle, but that's not the substance.
Right. That's right. The substance is always how they constitute a unity. Right. So I was going to throw up my little diagram here just in case it is helpful. Sorry, it's not the most. It's not very well photographed. Can everybody see it? Right. This is something I brought up last time, and I didn't have a diagram for it. But I was thinking about this also in the other group that was dealing with the proofs of the existence of God. And so the first thing I want to say about this is this is my little rendition of modern scientific thought, not Aristotelian thought, right? And and I just wanted to go over it a little bit because I wanted to make some points about what Aristotle is doing and how it fits together with, you know, our contemporary notions of science. The first thing I want to notice, or everybody to notice, is that this is just a diagram of what every scientist is doing when they investigate some kind of terrain, right? We have down at the very bottom, we have all these many individuals that behave in certain ways, exhibit certain regularities, right? And if you're investigating any of them, you will integrate them into, you'll find regularities, you'll express them mathematically, and then you'll have the next level up, you'll have social laws, chemical laws, biological laws, physical laws, right? As multiple sciences. And then the impetus, the striving of knowledge is not to just have a new multiplicity, right? Before we had a bunch of many individuals at the bottom, and now we have many sciences. And so the question becomes, well, if this is knowledge, right, then there must be some connection amongst them, right? And so we find higher order laws and that unify them. And we might only unify, right, some of them. We're at the third tier and the fourth tier. But the impetus of knowledge is always to go to the very top, the unified universal law. And it's only in this unified universal law that we have a comprehension of how the many domains of laws relate to one another and relate to the many things. Now, since what we're investigating in all of this is motion, right? Motion of societies, motion of chemicals, bonding and bonds breaking, life systems, physical systems, motion. This universal law, and this is the first point I really want to make, and I think I made it last time, but I just want to repeat it. Right? This universal law is, the very top, is not just like an explanation in words, but is the thing that brings the entire system in motion and holds it together as one unified regular system, so that no matter where we are in the world, we see the exact same regularities obtaining. Right? So this thought, the unified universal law, I just want everybody to think, when Aristotle starts talking about the unmoved mover, right, this is all you need to think about. Right? This law doesn't move. Right? And it's the law of the force that holds things together, that is the source of motion, that it exhibits itself at all the lower levels of thought, you know, all these different law systems, until we get down to where perception gives us the many individual things at the very bottom. So the law is infinite. It is one. It doesn't move, but it's the source of motion of everything. Um, and it is pure power. It is what brings things into motion and holds them into motion, right? We might call it, at one time in Newtonian physics, it was universal attraction, right? There's other names for this kind of phenomenon before, but the first thing I want to point out is this is how thought develops. Knowledge is always going towards this one universal explanatory law. Our thought, Aristotle's thought, medieval thought, it doesn't matter. So one point we can make here is that this unmoved mover, right, that some people find theological and distasteful, it can be conceptualized as nothing other than this universal law, that every scientific practice is striving towards, is working towards, whether the scientific practitioner is aware of it or not. Second thing to point out, right, perception here at the very bottom gives us a whole bunch of manys. These are not the solution to any problems. These are, this is where all the problems start, right? And they begin to be solved as you go up, you go up the page and you get clusters of lawful regularities that can be integrated into higher and higher levels until we have the universal system, right? The so-called theory of everything. But look to the right, I've put thought, right? All the action that is knowledge, right? All these different tiers and what distinguishes one tier from another, that's all in the realm of thought. That's all knowledge working itself out. Now, one thing I wanted to point out is, right, if you look at this diagram, we start with the little circles that are many at the bottom, and then we go a little bit higher, and we still have many, but we're at the law level now. And we go a little higher, we have fewer fewer groups of laws until we get to the very top, and we only have one universal law. And this is how I wanted to approach Charlie's and Nick's question a little bit. At least Charlie's about the starting points and elements, right? One way of thinking about the relationship of elements is to start with those many things at the very bottom the perception gives us. And those could be considered the elements out of which everything else here is somehow built up. But maybe the elements are not the things that perception gives us, but the first order set of laws that's still still a plurality, right? But they are that out of which the higher level laws will be built up out of in a different way, right? They're all laws, so they all are homogeneous, whereas the things that are given in perception are heterogeneous. They're different than those laws. So one way to think about the elements is everything at the line of perception. Another way to think of elements is the first tier of laws that I've named: social, chemical, etc. Those would be the elements. Or maybe the elements are the next level, which I haven't actually designated, but higher order laws that maybe now we finally got at the proper elements of the universal law. So we have different options of what would count as an element, right? The one being the perceptual objects that are themselves not laws, and so they're heterogeneous with respect to the laws. Or the elements can be homogeneous with what they're elements of, in which case we will reject the idea that the many at the bottom are actually the elements, but we'll go to the lower level of the laws and thereby find the proper elements. Now, if you think about it this way, right, there's different levels at which the elements might be localized. And so now we recognize as well that whatever yields the most explanatory account of what it is we're trying to explain. That level will contain the proper elements. So that level will be our starting points. That's where elements and starting points will coincide. So the starting points will be those elements that are most explanatory of a system in which there are many candidates for elements because there's different levels. So we need to keep elements and starting points separate because you can have elements that are not starting points. And indeed, if you start from the very top, the unified universal law, and you say, well, you only understand this whole system when you understand the universal law and then think down, right? Then we don't have any elements, then no element will be a starting point. So, so hopefully that makes clear why Aristotle needs a terminological distinction between elements and starting points. And the other thing it at least makes clear to me is that Aristotle is developing the internal system of any knowledge whatsoever, regardless of whether it's empirical or mathematical, or whether it's ancient or modern, right? And indeed, whether it's scientific or religious, because the same pattern, more or less, can be employed to think about how a religious person conceives the universe, right? The explanatory account always goes back to something that is infinite, that's pure act, that is one, that is that is the cause of all things. So this diagram helps us at least begin to appreciate that what Aristotle is doing is it's like a story, but if you think of a house with different stories, this is kind of the ground floor. Any knowledge is going to exhibit certain set of formal properties. And it doesn't matter if it's Greek science or modern science, and it doesn't even matter if it's theological science. If it's knowledge, it's going to be organized in a very specific way. And getting clear on that is a necessary precondition to doing whatever science you happen to be pursuing, to do it well, right? To know when you're within the bounds of your science, or whether you've exceeded the bounds of your science. So I think that's basically all I wanted to say. The point about the unmoved mover, or this, the universal law, or the God, as all these basically being synonyms, at least gives us some traction to say that, to think about Aristotle as either a theist or an atheist or an agnostic is too limiting a way of appreciating what's going on. These three categories, or these three concepts don't pertain to what's going on here. Right? We need a more generous categorical system than those three differences offer us in order to begin to appreciate at what level his philosophy is taking place. So this is the ground level, and in modern culture, science and religion are built on top of it. And that's why they're battling, because each side says, I'm the proper authority on this universal knowledge structure, right? And the only way this universal knowledge structure can be cashed out is in my system, says the scientist, or in my system, says the religious authority, or whatever, right? But the fact is that since they're mirror image of each other, neither of them are adequate to this more fundamental metaphysical level that I've tried to exhibit here a little bit in my diagram. So I see a question, so I'm going to finish that little digression and let people speak. Clark, go ahead.
Yeah, I appreciate what you did very much, because it clarifies for me how you're thinking about what we're both calling modern science. And so what you just said is that they're both working on the same thing. That's not my understanding of modern science. I mean, and so I don't want to get into no true Scotsman sort of fallacy talking, where where science is suddenly this movable object that anybody gets to decide what it is.
Right.
So I would like to give it more respect than that. I do have an argument. I would just say this, that from what I've learned so far and what you just portrayed, completely different kinds of knowledge. I agree with you that if I'm going to speak about knowledge in a classical sense, you've outlined it. And I also agree with you that modern science has been represented as being reflective of that same kind of knowledge. So that to that extent, I would say you're accurate, but you're picking and choosing certain people to portray modern science in doing that. And that's where it gets dicey. I would say I side on another group of folks that suggests that the knowledge that you've depicted, that you say all knowledge must have in common. If I'm thinking about it with my thoughts, yes. But one of the great benefit and contribution for me of modern science is that it completely has shown that it's an emperor with no clothes on, that kind of thinking. Because we had to actually reject Aristotle, we had to reject the church, we had to reject the monarchy, we had to reject three of the greatest institutions in order to make room for this new defeasible understanding of what knowledge is as I see it with modern science. So it's by defeasible, I mean probabilistic. It's probabilistic, and there's no laws as you've depicted them in my understanding of modern science. None. They're based on probabilities. They're based on uncertainty, not certainty. So it couldn't be more different, my understanding of science and of modern science. And I want to understand modern science better. And that's why I'm really interested in this, because this is where it came from. And it totally changed, the pillars of our identity as a species. I mean, modern science said the thinking doesn't work. We have to go back to these many at the bottom, and we never escape the many. We never escape the many. We tell stories about the many, but the many, what we turn up with when we go all the way up to the top is we come up with crystalline spheres and perfect circles and geometry and logic, which is not alive. It's in our mind alive, no question about it, but it's making the connection between what's alive in our mind with what's actually real, independent of our minds.
So I think there's one.
That's the real difficulty.
Sorry, there's a couple hands up, but Tyler, can you go after Garth and then Brendan?
Yeah.
Thanks. And Peter can jump in anytime.
Yeah, I think maybe the definition of laws that Michael used is different than what it's taken by many naturalistic thinkers, because as I've had law explained to me, it is a pattern in nature that is, for the most part, not broken. Like the law of gravitation is basically a collection of many observations which have a pattern in them. And then you formulate a theory, like the theory of gravity, to explain that law. And so you have two levels, right? You have the observations, and then you have the thought, and they're distinct from each other in this like naturalistic way of thinking.
Right.
Also, I want to point out that Aristotle does discuss things that are true for the most part. And he uses that phrase, or at least that's how it's translated in metaphysics, and probably talks about that in physics too. So it's not, Aristotle wasn't completely unaware of things that don't hold all the time. And he talks about that in Nicomachean Ethics too, that you can't really formulate absolute laws of ethics. You can only talk about what typically is the case.
Right. Yeah. I don't think my diagram goes against that at all. But I've said enough, so I want to hear from you guys about this, and then we'll head back into the text. So Brendan and then Tyler. Brendan, you there?
There we go. Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so I was just gonna offer that what was his name? The guy who was talking right before Garth.
Clark.
Clark. So Clark, you're very right about the fact that nowadays we can use Bayesian inference, hidden Markov chains, all these technologies from mathematics to just basically get a group of variables that with no theory attached to them and just find all these correlations that are probabilistic. I wouldn't say that that's what we're doing in science, though. I'd say that's more of a shortcut for engineering. To really be doing science, you have to be attempting to make necessary explanations for things. Otherwise, you're just there's no content to it. I don't know. I want to make that distinction between just science, just prediction, and a true science.
Cool. Tyler, go ahead.
Yeah, I think part of the problem with thinking that probability is a kind of science or is somehow escaping the laws of account giving is that probability itself is based on a certain kind of account of how things interact with each other that has to be justified itself.
Mm.
And so it presupposes a method but does not explain why that method should be the method.
Yeah.
And secondly, I think saying that we can't escape the many leads us to the question, many of what? And of course, part of the answer is many ones.
Mm.
So we just as well can't escape the one if we can't escape the many. But how we deal with that, I think, is a question of appropriate methodology, and sort of claiming that we can't deal with it, right, requires just as much justification as claiming that we can deal with it. The problem is that claiming that we can't deal with it leaves itself no possibility of an account which can know that we can't deal with it.
Mm. All right. Mike?
I also wanted to add that I think with science, one big blind spot is that it can't really account for the account of a thing or the essence or its ousia. I think it is stuck in the definition that states the components present in things. The other explanation for the starts where it's focused on, just, a bed is made up of 4 legs, a mattress, a headboard, whatever, but its function or the, what it's for, I don't think you can adequately explain that or assess that.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, thanks very much for your remarks. I think what I'd like to say is to Clark is you could actually, wherever you see the word law in my diagram, just add probabilistic in front of it. And then, but the diagram would be exactly the same. It doesn't change anything, right? Because when I'm developing a theory that's quantifiable, it's not just any quantities that will do, and it's not just any theory that will do, but it's going to be those mathematical equations that are integrated, that are integratable or already available in my domain of study. And that domain of study is not mathematically isolated from any of the other domains of study. And so when I'm doing my research, when I want to know what I'm investigating, I want the mathematical expressions of the behavior and regularities of the individuals I'm examining to not only get at them, but to not be in contradiction with the mathematized laws of my discipline. And that discipline cannot be separate from and in contradiction to the mathematized laws of other disciplines, but especially not the higher order ones. So I'm always constrained, no matter how probabilistic you want to interpret my laws, right? I'm always constrained to embed, to nest my work in concentric circles of law where there is no break. That's why it's so important for physicists to get relativity and quantum mechanics together, right? Because there is a break, and that is an irrational break. And what I want to say there is not any story will do. If all we needed was a narrative, like in some humanities, right? We would already have, plenty of narratives that would just bring them together, right? But the point is that they have to be brought together according to not just the probabilities, but the necessities that constitute each field of study. And so we always find ourselves, even no matter how probabilistic, I mean, it's obviously got to be over 50% because we don't want a science just based on coin tosses, right? So we always find ourselves embedded in higher order necessities that are expressed in the mathematical equations. And those higher order necessities are not unrelated to each other. And so as we go higher in order and higher order, we want our so-called unified field theory, or we want the theory of everything. That's that unified universal law, or laws, however that gets cashed out. That's at the top. And that's this, no matter how our methods, what I want to say is, no matter what you think about, no matter when you try to know, you will always know within this embedded fields of necessities. Again, no matter how probabilistic you interpret those laws, they're still going to, of necessity, be relatable to or derivable from higher order laws, and lower order laws have to be derivable from them. Okay, so I think that you could just add probabilistic to everything, and we'd still have the exact same model of knowledge as such that underlies all science, whether it's Greek or modern, and really all religious thought, and indeed all thought that purports to be knowledge will be organized in this way, towards the one, towards being, towards the unity of all things. That's in my language, that's internal to knowledge. And that's, I think, what Aristotle is helping us see and explicate. Tom, you've been patient. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I only want to say 2 comments about the drawing that you have here. The first one is that at the very bottom, all those heterogeneous little things, circles that you draw, I completely agree with them, that because they are different, the very first thing any scientist would want to do would be to unitize each one to make them generically similar to everything else. So so the word element that you use, another way to understand it is to say it is a unit. So you are unitizing everything that is different at that level. And that's how you're able to then find some commonality, or some common denominator, some distinguishing characteristic, some idion, catalu, or whatever, to find the next level. But then again, as you just described succinctly, iteratively speaking, at the next level, they will all be different. But then again, the next task is to unitize each one to make them similar again and again. And so that's the process for finding everything and putting everything together into what we call knowledge of everything. The second comment I would make is that the word thought that you have there. I agree also that Garth is correct. That what we say is, when we say thought, we're really saying there is a fact out there that is captured by the articulation, by the logos of what we are formed as a thought, a complete thought. And the complete thought is nothing more than that articulation of the fact that had been unifying everything that we have so far at each level, at each level of thinking, of thought. So that's it.
Awesome, thank you. And that you just helped me realize, that there's an accidental truth to my diagram insofar as the perceptual level is all horizontal and juxtaposed, right? But since thought is always, as you said, is discovering a commonality or a unity of the many, right? And thereby will produce a new many, and thereby need to find a higher unity, right? We're going now into a hierarchical order that is not given at the level of perception, but thought is purely hierarchized because of it is the process of discovering higher and higher order of unity. All right, so here we get that hierarchy. Here we get the higher order causes. Whereas at the perceptual level, we just notice some regularities that need to be mathematized and brought together into an eidos or a species so that we can investigate a whole bunch of things at the same time. Awesome. Thank you for your remarks, Tom. That give me a perception to my own diagram that I didn't have before. Hey, Garth and Clark.
I'm not saying that this is adequate, but I want to talk a little bit about the ground up approach a little bit here. And if we really try to strictly follow the ground up approach, we won't quite get a diagram like what Michael has drawn here, even though I think in our casual thinking, in our naive realism, so to speak, we really do construct the diagram the way Michael has. It's not correct if we really want to strictly stick to a bottom up approach, because at the bottom we have like atoms, we have electrons, forces of nature, the unified rules of physics. And so immediately above that bottom point, then from a bottom up point of view, you would have physics, and then chemistry would be predicated on physical laws, and then biology would be predicated on chemical laws, and there might even be more steps in here, but you get to social laws after biology.
Mm-hmm.
But what that also means is that any fact is not a physical fact. It is a social fact, and all facts are social. And I'm sort of appreciating Hegel here a little bit. And you can't just go out and observe an electron outside of the social context. And then, even though I forget her name, there was some philosopher who wrote a paper about how physics is racist. And a lot of right-wingers were attacking her on Twitter. But she sort of has a point, there is a sociality even in the practice of physical science. Anyway.
Thanks. Clark and then Peter.
Yeah, just quick question. This is what's kind of stuck in my craw at the moment. How can unreliable many create reliable one as you go up your chart? In other words, how can, if the many are not quite reliable, I mean, we're looking for classification, we're looking to classify them, we're looking to group them, the many. If they're not reliable to that extent, how are we claiming that we can come up with a classification that is towards the one at that level that is going to have reliability, as if the relationships between what is unreliable is somehow going to produce reliability when the things themselves are not reliable? It seems to me I'm missing something here that's stuck for me. Cool. I don't understand the movement. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I think I was going to answer that question because it was actually a good segue into the point I was going to try and make. If you look at the bottom, you have all these perceptual little dots. They're of one sort of, they're the things that can change. That first line from the dots up to whatever the first level of laws is, I'm not even going to worry about his labels. That is of a different sort of line than all the other lines on that diagram all the way up. That a particular dot falls under a category, like it's part of a chemical law or whatever. That is essentially doxa, that's opinion. Knowledge is only within the relationships amongst the genus and species.
Right.
It's a different sort of type of relationship between the perceptible things jumping into the knowable things. So you don't have that problem. Yes, all the perceptual things are unreliable in a sense, but knowledge never changes. I mean, a cat has 4 legs and a tail and meows or whatever. That's what the essence of a cat is. And I'm not sure that's really the essence of a cat. A cat, maybe the essence is to go hunt mice or something.
Whiskers.
That that's the that thing doesn't change. That a cat can lose a leg, you can lop a leg off and still a cat. Doesn't that's just a perceptual thing. And furthermore, you know, maybe it's in B4, someplace here, or maybe it's just later in B3. He talks about the difference between there can be no science of the individuals. It's only the next level up that you can actually have the science.
Right. Right. Yeah. So that's. I think that's a posit to what Clark was saying. So I'm not going to interject. I like what you said, and I agree with it. Mike, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I did want to point out, Clark, one of the things you mentioned, and this is great, Clark. I love that you're asking all these questions because they're definitely making me think too. But I think toward the end, you did ask, like, you didn't understand this movement, right? And it's already, I guess Michael earlier talked about commitments or convictions one makes, and that these commitments or convictions, I guess, is what Aristotle is questioning. And when you say, yeah, you don't understand this movement, you're already presupposing movement, right? Like you're assessing this chart based on relationships and movements. So there's, I would claim that these things like movements, relationships, sameness, difference are non-empirical, and it's what we're using to form these categories. And of course, like Peter said, whether one of those dots belongs in one thing or another is, yeah, it's an opinion. It's based on fallible perception. However, when we make these categories, like the category of a cat or a dog, that is knowledge. And anyway, just wanted to throw that out there.
I appreciate that. You know, one thing that made me think, you know, experience theories are undetermined by experience. I think that's a commonplace in the philosophy of science, right? And so theory choice is often motivated by considerations of simplicity and harmony and elegance. And these criteria that are deployed to choose between theories, these themselves are not empirical knowledge, which is why there's very little dispute about whether one thing is more simple than the other or more harmonious than the other. And there's a great deal of agreement among scientists about these criteria. And so one of the things I'm trying to do by this thought, you know, this level of thought, that's where knowledge is taking place. Perception gives us something to think about. And we think about it with, you know, in terms of different unities, and indeed, those unities themselves can either be simple or complex. They can be elegant or inelegant, right? They can be clumsy unities, right? And so thought is always using its own built-in criteria about what is simple and what is beautiful or elegant to hone these theory choices. And so neither Aristotle nor any other empirical work is infallible. And part of the point of philosophy is to understand why that is. Because what we've done here is say, it is infallibly the case that empirical work is fallible. And we need to understand that higher order knowledge we have about fallibility itself and what its scope is. How far does it extend? What are its limits? Is there infallible knowledge? Is there knowledge that's just knowledge as such, right? And part of the point of this course is, or this common project, right, is to get to the point where we start to understand mind itself, right? We had, Clark, you talked about mind a little bit, and you imported some beliefs about mind that I don't think Aristotle would share. And so it's going to be very interesting, I think, for you and for all of us to, you know, when we ascend to the level of mind or nous, right, the level of the infallible, how he justifies that and how he talks about it. So, but that is the domain where, you know, considerations about, you know, where do we know, or how do we have the criterion of simplicity? How do we have the criterion of elegance? And how do we have these criterion that themselves are higher order criteria for determining theory choice? You know, they're not empirical, and that's what I always kind of want to get people to turn to, and that would be, you know, part of my diagram here, that those should be included in the thought. And thought levels, but those would be even higher up, and it would also change the topic. I just really wanted to get at the idea of the unmoved mover as the law of laws, the thing that the force that is, or the force of universal attraction that holds everything together, right? It doesn't move, yet it moves everything. And we don't need to start talking about God here already, although we could, because the exact same properties are what at least some religions attribute to God. And that's interesting. Why is that? Okay, yeah, thanks. That was another digression of mine. I think it's Charlie first and then Garth.
Well, I don't know if this will add anything at all, probably not, but you know, when he uses the, in the translation here, if you look what we read a while ago, for example, in the the second paragraph in line 6 there, he starts, if to get scientific knowledge of beings is to get it of the species.
Yeah.
Which he, of course, would say, yes, that's where you get scientific knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
I think the word scientific is a problem.
Yeah.
I think what Aristotle, and a lot of times for my own reading, I put an alternate phrase in there. Sometimes I use, you know, if you want to get proper understanding of beings, is to get it from the species.
Right. No, that's excellent.
And I think that's what Aristotle's going for. He's going for, how do we actually know? That's what he's answering the question.
Mm-hmm.
And what is our proper understanding, and where does proper understanding come from? And I think that word science here, I don't know what it is in the Greek, but I think that's an unhappy term.
Right.
For this, for the idea.
No, I think you're right. And I think we read it anachronistically, and yeah, you're totally right. And I do think that, you know, a comprehension is probably a better way.
Something that has to do with
right.
comprehension or understanding.
Exactly.
Or grasping. Or,
exactly.
You know,
exactly.
Accurately grasping, accurately understanding.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree with that.
What's the Greek term? Do you have
episteme.
it there?
Episteme is always, for some reason, always translated by scientia, that then becomes science. Yeah, and
I don't find that very helpful, really.
Right, but it's because of the historical fate of the word science, right? I mean, the historical fate of the word science is such that it has now so many meanings contrary to what Aristotle is trying to get at, that it just creates a semantic blur in these texts, like science. Wait, what? How can that be science, right? Yeah. And our brain just goes explodes, and it's like, how can that be science, right? Yeah, I totally get it, but you know, I think adequate comprehension, or a comprehension of the thing insofar as it's the thing we're talking about, you know, it would be clumsy, but I think it would get exactly at right, at what he's trying to get at, right? Which is, how do we talk about the thing as what it is, rather than in terms of something that it's not, or something peripheral to it, right? Right. If we don't want to talk about it in terms of what's peripheral to it, we need to know what's essential to it, right? And so now are starting talking about essences, but they're not inscrutable, intuitions and mystical experiences or anything like that. It's just that a consequence of the logical distinction of trying to of separating, as we did in the very beginning in the categories, substance from accident. Thanks, Garth, for waiting. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. I was going to say, isn't this how wisdom is related to science? I'm sort of going back to what you were saying a little bit earlier, Michael, about the nature of probability or inconsistency, because right, this is something that you said during the Schmidt meetup like 2 years ago or whenever, when
good memory.
Yeah, if you start by saying there's no such thing as knowledge, then you know that, and it's a contradiction already. It's self-contradictory. And so the little observations like this, I think, constitute wisdom, and this is how you come to know, because if you start out with this spaghetti of all of these assertions of all of these different scientific inquiries, then you'll find that they are self-contradictory and they contradict each other, and you need to sort it out. And it seems like this is what Aristotle does a lot of the time, right? He goes through all these aporia in order to sort them out and to try to come to a internally consistent presentation.
Right. Agreed.
So yeah, and I was going to say, both Plato and Aristotle had a notion of perceptibles, right? And perceptibles, there is no knowledge of perceptibles,
right?
So they I don't know. The more I think about it, the less I think it is really different than the modern practice of science.
Yeah, that's what I want to get at, right? Obviously empirical theories come and go, but there's a level of reflection about knowledge and consistency and all the rest of it that I think are continuous from the Greeks on, and that the moderns learn from them. And so maybe one of the lessons of this course is don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's a lot more to Aristotle that explains our own modern scientific thinking than you can find in modern scientific thinking, because too much has been abstracted out for methodological reasons, has been bracketed. And right. So Clark, then Peter.
Yeah, I agree with you what you just said, Michael, and also Garth. But there's something more to say. Well, with Garth, you said there's no such thing as knowledge. That's a knowledge statement. Agreed. But knowledge can also be understood ambiguously in that statement. What constitutes knowledge? The way we use our minds. Well, let me give you an example. What I'm thinking of a lot. I'm reading a lot of evolutionary biology right now. And you talk about what a being is, and then you walk in the shoes of, the Galapagos, trouncing around the Galapagos Islands like Darwin did. And you start noticing that the being of one species does seem related to another species. And here we are using our thinking statically regarding what is evidently, whatever you believe about evolution, this is the point, that being evolves. So it's like Heraclitus's river. Things are constantly changing, and yet we're using what we're calling knowledge in a static way, taking just snapshots of what is actually in great movement. We are fragments of the earth or the universe, however you want to say it. We evolved, life came out of, changed its being in front of us. What is the significance of being that is so malleable like Heraclitus's river?
Go ahead, Mike, if you want to follow up on, and then Peter.
I think when you talk about being there, though, you might be conflating stuff. Like the essence of one instance of a certain species of not 200, anyway, iguanas. That's one being, right? That has a substance. And then if you look at another species that, let's say, it's evolved into, and of course, this is an empirically based theory, but that would be another being. But to say one being has evolved into another being is like saying Clark has evolved into Mike, I guess, right? So I just wanted to make that distinction.
Interesting. Okay, thanks. Peter?
First, I just want to point out at 6 p.m., so we're officially done. But secondly, doing a little bit in response to Clark, was that regardless of how we use the word know or knowledge today, I think the Greeks back in the day were pretty set on that it's not knowledge unless it's necessary and doesn't change. We're not going to use the word knowledge for that thing.
Right.
So it's probabilistic things in some sense are not knowledge,
right,
under the Greek use of the word. Whether we use the word differently today, it's kind of irrelevant, but to understand that. And then again, the distinction between matter and substance, which is a bit what Mike was getting at. Maybe evolution talks about the evolution of matter, but not of substance. Darwin's theory is not a theory of substance, about substance.
Right. Right. And oh, go ahead, Peter.
Should I let me know when I should stop recording?
Okay. I mean, the conversation is still interesting and might be of interest. So I'd say let's keep recording. Right. But what I want to throw in here is even evolution, even such sloppy thinkers as evolutionary theorists will make a distinction between change and evolution. Not every change is an evolution, right? Not every dying thing is evolving, right? And so now we've got a world, the Galapagos Islands, right? And when is evolving taking place and when is change taking place? And when is something changing into itself and when is something changing into another, right? These are the ground level questions that Aristotle's system is designed to flesh out so that we have a better understanding of precisely that. When is a thing changing to remain itself? When is a thing changing and becoming another, right? And if something evolves, is it the same or another, right? Evolutionary theory won't give us any guidance on that. There's always the looseness in these concepts, which is fecund scientifically. I'm not going to denock the science. It's fecund, it's productive, it's creative, it's wonderful, right? But it's blurry, and maybe that's part of its success. I'm not denying it. But what we're looking for is clarity. We want to know, when is evolution? What distinguishes evolution from change? When is a thing the same, even though it's different? And those are, again, not empirical questions. And they are questions that are themselves begged because they're not clarified in evolutionary theory itself, except in some meta theories, but those are not always necessarily informing scientific practice in evolutionary biology to the extent to which I'm familiar with it. So I just want to say again, I don't think that what Aristotle is doing and any empirical science is doing, it's just Aristotle is in the ground level, right, at the edifice, and all these empirical sciences are up here using sometimes Aristotelian insights, sometimes using things that are completely, irrelevant to what Aristotle is doing, but nevertheless, they're always obtaining knowledge. And so they're always constrained by what precisely Aristotle's setting out as the necessary framework for knowledge of anything. Right? When we started the categories, the first thing we came to this understanding, right? To be anything is to be in dependence relationships. So we do not know any being except insofar as we can situate it, nest it in dependence relationships, right? Either it's dependent on some things, other things are dependent on it, right? This picture of mine shows a more complicated dependency relationship, but it's still just dependence relations. And evolutionary theory doesn't violate that. It's always looking for different dependence relations. And so it's just working out the inner structure of any knowledge whatsoever. And what we as philosophers are doing are getting clear about that. What is that? And what else are we committed to? Once we understand knowledge, what else are we committed to? That's an interesting question that broaches on cosmological questions and theological questions and moral questions. Anyway, thanks for listening to my little discourse. Tyler, go ahead. Thanks for your patience.
Oh, hi. Yeah, someone else probably covered what I said, but or what I was going to say, but I wanted to point out that Mike's iguana example is the example or the problem of substance, right? In order to understand something is evolving, you have to understand, in some sense, how it has stayed the same and yet is different.
Mm-hmm.
And that, of course, is at the level Aristotle is working at.
Right.
The other thing is, oh, have I forgotten it?
Shit, sorry. That's my bad.
Yeah, I'll get back to it. I'm gonna.
Okay. Okay, so I'm happy to talk some more. It's good to see everybody. I do apologize for slightly derailing. So I will say that next time we will definitely talk about why being is not a genus. And so I really want everybody to think closely about that, which is P7 in the breakdown in the book, and because that's related to the whole question of being later on.
Oh, I remember.
Oh, go for it then.
I was just gonna point out that so the evidence, right, is not something we observe in perception. Rather, it's a way of relating to our perceptions through thought. And so all evidence-based methodologies start from a way of thinking about the many, not derived from the many itself.
But that was too oracular.
The many being the many of perception here.
What does that have to do with evidence? I like the evidence point, but then you took me on a
we don't derive the concept of evidence from objects in perception. Rather, we take objects of our perception to be evidence of something.
No, I think that's powerful. You know, evidence itself is not perceivable. You have to understand what's relevant. Again, we're starting from top down here, right? What's relevant to my inquiry? And only through an understanding of what it is I'm inquiring into and the kind of inquiry I'm engaging in. Am I engaging in a question of what it's becoming? Am I engaging in a question of what it's not becoming? Am I engaging in a question of what are its relationship to other things, right? Each one of those lays down a whole track of well, what could be considered evidence for that? And with this concept of evidence, we then proceed to our perceptions comprehendingly, and we can, because Tyler's right, we would never get the idea of evidence from any perception. Yeah, thank you, Garth.
Yeah, I also think that that's a really good point about evidence. And gee, I forgot what I was going to say, but I forgot my first point. But my second point is getting back to evolution a little bit. That oh yeah, no, that's my first point. My first point is because we need to know what evidence is. This is the essence of the difficulty in science, right? It's formulating a theory, then coming up with some kind of way to test that theory requires us to have a theory of what the evidence is and what the evidence against the theory is, right?
Right.
And if you take a strictly falsifiability tact, you're basically just reducing science to nonsense, I think, because then there can be no demonstration of science. There's only the demonstration of when it's false. So then the true is defined in terms of the false, and that's completely nonsensical.
Interesting.
But,
yeah, go ahead.
And okay, evolution is a problem that demonstrates the paucity of our understanding of the environment and the natural world, because we started out with a desire to have an account for how these creatures came to be. But then that account, evolution, demonstrates that the creatures don't have the essence that we thought they did.
Right.
So we need to figure out what the real essence of nature is. And I think it's you know, that you can't really take the creature out of its environment.
Right.
And that kind of thing.
Right.
Anyway.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah. Awesome. So I appreciate the attention that you devoted to my snazzy little diagram here. You know, there are certain points that Aristotle we're in the metaphysics. We're not in the physics, so we're not actually doing a specific science, but we're reflecting on the sciences that are already obtained, right? That's what he gets, he gives us examples from sounds, the vocal sounds, right? So we get from grammar and from linguistics and from mathematics and from astronomy and from arithmetic and geometry. I mean, these are the established sciences, right? So there is science and there is knowledge, because in each one of these sciences, we can show that one hypothesis or one theory is erroneous and another explains what needs to be explained. And so we have knowledge of that. And then on the basis of that knowledge, we explore some more, and that allows us to revise what we thought we knew, or embed it in a broader context, which causes us to revise our original understanding of what it is we're inquiring into, right? And so we're in this organic knowledge process already, and Aristotle's looking at all these sciences, and he takes his examples from all the different sciences, right? And is trying to get at the idea of that, in a sense, all of these sciences know what is, but they only know parts of what is. But they know those parts. And that yields the question, right? Insofar as each one knows that it's knowing a part of being, doesn't that imply that there is some tacit, subterranean knowledge of what being as such is? To know that something's a part of being implies that there must be something more to be said about being as such. And I think that motivates this question that we can't get at from by doing empirical sciences. Yeah, so I guess that's really all I wanted to say on that question. But I do think that Aristotle is looking at his sciences and giving us, genus and species and difference and all these things that make sense of the different layers of causality, the different layers of dependence in all of these different sciences. We don't really know the content of those sciences very well, right? So we need to look at our science, because our science is science, right? It's a system of knowledge, and it's built up like mathematics, or it's built up like the theory of music and harmony, right? Why are they all built up similarly, right? Because they're all examples of knowledge. And so there are certain things, logical points that he's going to make that I think can be illustrated pretty well with a diagram of this sort that is loosely based on what is going on in any scientific inquiry today. How is the thought of my domain related to other domains, right? And through a system of probabilistic laws that at higher and higher levels are more and more ordered, are more and more integrated. So I think that some of the logical points can be made just as well in our science as his, that we know, at least I personally know, too little of. So I'm going to use a diagram, or this diagram, or something like it further on down the road to illustrate certain points. So I'm glad we had a chance to flesh it out and work through some potential misunderstandings that this diagram, as hasty as it was, might give rise to. Any other thoughts? We ready to call it a day?
I did have one question for the more science literate folks among us, which is regards probability. So I'm aware of constant conjunction in philosophy. So if probability were based on constant conjunction, it would be simply expecting that things that have commonly occurred will continue to commonly occur. It will have something like that structure. And I'm wondering if probability in science is, in what respect is it different from that, or is it?
I don't think that that is addressed in, I mean, that's like not a science question, that's a philosophy of science question, I think, because I mean, in a lot of probability, it's just taken as an axiom that if the probability is 1 or 100%, then that's equal to necessity or certainty. But that's not proven, that's usually just given as an axiom. So it's just assumed.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my question is, how do you arrive at a conclusion that something is more or less probable? What's the principle?
Are you talking about more than just statistical measure? It does sound like it's a little more philosophical than.
Well, statistical measure involves philosophical concepts, right? Measurement.
Sure. Well, okay.
Yeah. Because all measurement takes something to be the same with respect to something else.
Well,
Sure.
oftentimes a certain distribution is assumed based on the thing that's being measured, like heights of people, I think, follow a normal distribution, which has a certain shape. And other things follow a uniform distribution, which means that every outcome has equal probability. Like if you roll a die, there's an equal chance of getting each of the faces of the die if it's a fair die, right? But that, that's largely based on mathematical results. And oftentimes the reason why things are formulated a certain way is so that it's possible to calculate a result, not necessarily because that's the way nature is, but because otherwise you couldn't do the math.
I guess
That's
I have
really
the one
prevalent
problem
in
I have
statistics.
with the die example is there is no, I mean, mathematics involves necessary relations. There is no probability, I think, in pure math, really. Probability assumes something which could be otherwise, I think, right?
Let me answer your question. I think I understand if I understand your question, Tyler, what is probability? I'm going to fall back to my Aristotelian logic teacher from a book by H.W.B. Joseph. It's a 1916 book on logic. And in that book, probability is about information about a whole class. So if human beings is a class or a genus of human beings, then probability pertains to information we can gain from the class itself, not on the individual things, but on the class or on the genus or species in this case. So that's when you say, what's the population of living human beings? Well, that's a number. And then what are some of the characteristics of those human beings with a certain trait, certain characteristics? Then those are probabilities, meaning those are numbers that can be calculated and can be counted on a sample size to a population size and so on. So the distinction between